They came through the Twilight Zone as rising stars, familiar faces, or complete unknowns. Some went on to win Oscars, others vanished without a trace. A few found fame, fortune, and cult followings, while others faced scandal, heartbreak, or bizarre twists even Rod Serling couldn't have written. In this video, we're digging into the real stories behind the guest stars of the original Twilight Zone. Where did they go? What happened after the cameras stopped rolling? You're about to find out, and trust us, not everyone got a Hollywood ending. Robert Redford, the golden boy who outran time. Before he was a Hollywood icon, Robert Redford stepped quietly into the Twilight Zone in the haunting 1962 episode Nothing in the Dark, playing a young, injured police officer who turns out to be much more than he seems. Even then, his presence was magnetic, his performance soft-spoken, but impossible to ignore. It was a glimpse into a future only a few could have predicted. Redford was destined to become one of the most recognizable faces in American film history. Over the decades, Redford built an extraordinary career that few actors or directors have matched. From Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid to All the President's Men and The Sting, his resume reads like a masterclass in classic cinema. But it wasn't just the roles he played, it was the way he carried himself. Charismatic, thoughtful, quietly rebellious, he wasn't just a movie star. He was the movie star for a generation who wanted their heroes to have both style and substance. As the years passed, he evolved from leading man to behind-the-camera visionary. Founding the Sundance Institute and Film Festival, he gave independent filmmakers a platform and forever changed the way movies are made and seen. And though he announced his retirement from acting in 2018 after The Old Man and The Gun, Redford never truly faded from view. His influence lives on in every indie film that challenges convention and every actor who chooses depth over flash. Now in his late 80s, Redford has stepped away from the spotlight, living a quiet life focused on conservation and family. But for those who watched him walk through the Twilight Zone all those years ago, it's clear Robert Redford didn't just survive Hollywood. He mastered it. William Shatner, the man who looked fear in the eye. Twice. William Shatner didn't just pass through the Twilight Zone, he crashed into it. Twice. First in Nick of Time, playing a man gripped by superstition. Then again, more famously, in Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, where he stared out an airplane window and saw the face of madness in the form of a gremlin on the wing. It's one of the most iconic moments in TV history, and the perfect metaphor for a career that would defy gravity, logic, and time itself. Shatner didn't become a household name because he played it safe. He became a legend because he didn't. Just a few years after his Twilight Zone appearances, he stepped onto the bridge of the USS Enterprise as Captain James T. Kirk, a role that would define him, launch a fandom, and carve his name into sci-fi immortality. But Shatner's story didn't stop at Star Trek. Not even close. He wrote books, recorded albums, spoofed himself, won Emmys, Boston Legal, and kept finding new ways to stay in the spotlight. At times, people mocked his style. Dramatic, exaggerated, uniquely Shatner. But that became part of the charm. He was in on the joke, and he kept showing up. Then, in 2021, at age 90, William Shatner did something no one expected. He went to space. For real. Aboard Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin rocket, he became the oldest person to ever leave Earth. When he came back down, he wasn't just an actor who once played a space captain, he was a man who actually went. Today, well into his 90s, Shatner is still working, still performing, still talking, tweeting, and taking up space in the best possible way. For a guy who once saw a gremlin on a wing, nothing about his life has ever been ordinary. Charles Bronson, the silent tough guy who walked alone. When Charles Bronson appeared in the Twilight Zone episode 2, opposite Elizabeth Montgomery, he didn't say a word for most of it. He didn't need to. His eyes, his stance, the weight he carried in his body told the whole story. In a world ravaged by war, he was a man surviving with quiet intensity. That role wasn't a stretch, it was a preview of the man he'd become, both on screen and off. Bronson was never Hollywood's loudest voice, never the smooth talker or polished lead. But he was real, and audiences knew it. Coming from a tough Pennsylvania coal mining town, he carried that grit into everything he did. By the 1970s, he had become the face of a very specific kind of American masculinity, hard-edged, weathered, and unshakable. In films like Death Wish, The Mechanic, and Once Upon a Time in the West, he wasn't flashy, he was final. When Bronson showed up, you knew something was about to be settled. Despite his fame, Bronson stayed intensely private. He rarely gave interviews, avoided red carpets, and didn't chase celebrity. He lived simply, often retreating to his ranch, far from Hollywood's spotlight. He married fellow actor Jill Ireland, and their relationship became one of the most enduring and public aspects of his life. Her passing in the early 90s hit him hard, and afterward, Bronson quietly stepped back from acting. In his later years, he lived away from the cameras, his public appearances becoming rare. He passed away in 2003, leaving behind a legacy that's still felt in every modern anti-hero character that grits their teeth and stands their ground. Charles Bronson didn't chase attention. He didn't need to. He came in, said little, and made sure you'd never forget him. Jack Klugman, the voice of the underdog. Few actors fit into the Twilight Zone as naturally as Jack Klugman. He wasn't a matinee idol or a mysterious stranger. He was the guy you knew, your neighbor, your brother, your friend. His characters struggled, doubted, hoped, and broke. And in each of his 4 Twilight Zone episodes, he brought something rare, heart. In A Passage for Trumpet, he played a failed musician teetering on the edge of giving up, a man invisible to the world, until death gives him a second chance. In Praise of Pip, he's a bookie who finds redemption in a battlefield hallucination of his dying son. Klugman didn't need elaborate makeup or sci-fi effects. He just stood there vulnerable and let the emotion do the work. But The Twilight Zone was just one chapter in a long, remarkable career. In the 1970s, Klugman became a household name as Oscar Madison in The Odd Couple, bringing warmth and hilarious chaos to the messy half of TV's most famous mismatched duo. Later, in Quincy, M.E., he played a crusading medical examiner, one of the first TV characters to challenge systemic issues through his work. He gave voice to the unheard, both in fiction and reality. Off-screen, Klugman faced his own battles. He lost a vocal cord to throat cancer, but even that didn't silence him. He returned to acting with a raspy voice and the same fire in his eyes. It wasn't about perfection. It never was. It was about truth. When he passed in 2012, it felt like we'd lost someone we knew. Because Jack Klugman didn't just play ordinary men, he elevated them. He gave them dignity, humor, and a place in stories that mattered. In The Twilight Zone, he reminded us that even the broken can find meaning. And in life, he proved it. Roddy McDowall, the eternal outsider who found his place. Roddy McDowall was already a familiar face when he appeared in the Twilight Zone episode People Are Alike All Over. He played an astronaut, idealistic and hopeful, only to discover that even on another planet, human nature remains disturbingly the same. It was a fitting role. McDowall often played outsiders, observers, men who didn't quite fit in. And in some ways, that's who he was in Hollywood too. Always present, always respected, but never quite chasing the spotlight. A child star in 1940s, McDowall made the rare and difficult leap from young actor to serious adult performer. His career wasn't defined by one role, it was defined by adaptability. In the 1960s and 70s, he became synonymous with the Planet of the Apes franchise, where his nuanced performances beneath layers of prosthetics brought humanity to non-human characters. He made you feel for a chimpanzee scientist more than most actors could make you feel for another person. But McDowall wasn't just an actor. He was a photographer, a film historian, and one of the most well-connected figures in the entertainment world, not because he played the game, but because people trusted him. He kept others' secrets, showed up for their premieres, quietly helped behind the scenes. His home became a kind of Hollywood salon where legends felt comfortable being themselves. He never married, and he didn't build a tabloid-friendly persona. Instead, he built a life of deep friendships, artistic curiosity, and quiet class. When he passed away in 1998, it wasn't with fanfare or spectacle, but with sincere respect from an industry that doesn't often give it easily. Roddy McDowall may not have always stood in the center of the frame, but he was always essential. A steady presence in a changing world, just like the best Twilight Zone stories. Lee Marvin, the tough guy who carried a quiet weight. Lee Marvin didn't just play hard men, he was one. When he stepped into the Twilight Zone episode Steel, he portrayed a washed-up boxer in a near-future world where human fighters had been replaced by robots. Down on his luck, clinging to relevance, Marvin's character ends up pretending to be a machine just to survive. It was raw, physical, and tragic, and strangely close to the truth of who Lee Marvin was beneath the tough exterior. He served in the Marines during World War II, wounded in battle, and carried that experience into every role. You could see it in his eyes. He knew violence, understood silence, and wore pain like an old jacket. When he growled through roles in The Dirty Dozen, Point Blank, and Cat Ballou, for which he won an Oscar, it wasn't performance, it was something deeper, more lived in. Hollywood tried to shape him into a leading man, but Marvin didn't smooth his edges. He kept the roughness. He picked roles that felt real, loners, outlaws, men who had been through something. Off-screen, he lived with a similar edge. He wasn't one for PR polish. He drank hard, lived hard, and spoke his mind, even when it didn't help his image. But there was more to him than the gravel and grit. Marvin was intelligent, political, and principled. He stood up for what he believed in, even when it cost him. He wasn't interested in being charming. He was interested in being honest. By the 1980s, Marvin had pulled back from acting, content to let the legends grow on their own. When he passed in 1987, it felt like the end of a certain kind of Hollywood, the kind where men didn't explain themselves, they just stood their ground. Lee Marvin didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He was the kind of man you listen to in the silence. Burgess Meredith, the man who could never catch a break. Until he did. If the Twilight Zone had a patron saint, it might just be Burgess Meredith. He appeared in more episodes than any other guest star, and each time he left a mark. Whether playing a book-loving loner in Time Enough at Last, a desperate man on trial for thought in The Obsolete Man, or a bumbling goof who becomes superhuman in Mr. Dingle, the Strong, Meredith captured what the Twilight Zone did best, putting ordinary people in extraordinary situations. He had a face for tragedy and a voice for poetry, weary, animated, quietly aching. And though he seemed born for classic television, his career was anything but smooth. Early on, he was blacklisted during the McCarthy era, his roles drying up almost overnight. For a while, he was just a voice in shadows, narrating, waiting, surviving. But like the characters he played, Burgess didn't give up. He waited for time to come back around, and it did. In the 1960s, he found new life as the Penguin in the Batman TV series, turning villainy into campy perfection. Then came perhaps his most surprising role, Mickey, the gruff boxing trainer in Rocky. Gravel-voiced and full of fire, he delivered one of the most quoted lines in film history and earned an Oscar nomination. Just like that, Meredith became a household name again, this time with a whole new generation. In his later years, he worked steadily, in dramas, comedies, even voiceovers. He passed away in 1997 at the age of 89, leaving behind a career that spanned 6 decades, 2 comebacks, and more unforgettable characters than most actors get in a lifetime. Burgess Meredith was never the hero or the heartthrob, but he was always the soul. And in the Twilight Zone, that made him unforgettable. Rod Serling, the man who spoke for the silent. When you think of the Twilight Zone, you think of Rod Serling, suit, cigarette, voice like midnight thunder. He didn't just introduce the stories. He was the story. The words, the warnings, the whispered truths. Behind the surreal tales of aliens, time warps, and invisible enemies, there was always something deeply human, and Serling was the one holding the mirror. He wrote the majority of the series' episodes, not just quickly but brilliantly, infusing them with moral weight, social commentary, and a kind of quiet anger. Censorship in the 1950s pushed him away from traditional TV dramas. He found a loophole in science fiction, a way to talk about racism, war, conformity, and cruelty without ever naming names. He gave the voiceless a voice, wrapped in allegory and shadow. Before the Twilight Zone, Serling was already a respected writer. After, he was a legend. Yet the fame never seemed to sit easily. He was restless, passionate, and deeply frustrated by the limitations of television. He wanted people to think, not just watch. And that ambition came at a cost. The pressure, the deadlines, the endless rewriting, it all wore him down. In later years, he taught, spoke openly about politics, and even returned to narration with Night Gallery. But the Twilight Zone remained his masterpiece, the place where he said what needed to be said in the only way the networks would allow. Rod Serling died young at just 50. His heart gave out, but not before his words reached millions. And they still do. Every rerun, every quote, every eerie twist is a reminder of one man's brilliance and his belief that fiction could mean something. He didn't just host the Twilight Zone. He opened the door and dared us to walk through. Elizabeth Montgomery, from Silent Survivor to TV's most magical woman. In the Twilight Zone episode 2, Elizabeth Montgomery barely speaks. She plays a lone survivor in a desolate, war-torn world, a woman hardened by destruction, but still human beneath the silence. It's a stark, haunting performance, and one that few remember came from the same woman who would later twitch her nose and cast a spell over millions. Because not long after The Twilight Zone, Elizabeth Montgomery became Samantha Stevens in Bewitched, and her career and image changed forever. Gone was the hardened survivor. In her place stood a warm, witty, effortlessly charming witch who made suburban life sparkle. The role was iconic, the show a smash hit, and Montgomery became one of the most beloved television stars of the 1960s. But Elizabeth Montgomery was never just the character she played. Off-screen, she was sharp, politically outspoken, and deeply involved in causes that mattered to her, from women's rights to AIDS awareness. She often chose roles that pushed against the boundaries people tried to place on her, especially after Bewitched ended. In made-for-TV movies and dramatic roles, she tackled subjects that weren't always easy or comfortable. Unlike many stars of her era, Montgomery didn't cling to fame. She aged gracefully, stayed mostly out of the tabloid spotlight, and focused on meaningful work, both in front of the camera and behind the scenes. Her final performances in the 90s showed a more serious, grounded actress who had long outgrown the sparkles and spells of her youth. Elizabeth Montgomery passed away in 1995, but her presence remains. Whether remembered as the woman who turned everyday life into magic or as the quiet survivor in a post-apocalyptic world, she left behind more than just roles. She left a legacy of quiet power, charm, and control over her own story. Telly Savalas, the cool stranger who became a star. When Telly Savalas appeared in the Twilight Zone episode Living Doll, he wasn't a hero, far from it. He played Eric Streeter, a cold, resentful stepfather who slowly unravels when his stepdaughter's talking doll, Talkie Tina, starts saying things no toy should say. It's a chilling, unforgettable performance, not because of any special effects, but because of him. He made you believe this man could lose everything to a 6-inch threat. At the time, Savalas was still carving out a place in Hollywood. He didn't look or sound like a typical leading man. Bald, gravel-voiced, often cast as villains or tough guys, he brought a raw edge to every role, but also a strange, captivating charm. People noticed. Not long after The Twilight Zone, he began landing bigger roles in films like The Dirty Dozen, Kelly's Heroes, and On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Then came the role that changed everything, Kojak. As the lollipop-sucking, smooth-talking detective with a badge and a bite, Savalas redefined TV cool in the 1970s. "Who loves you, baby?" wasn't just a catchphrase, it was a cultural moment. Kids imitated him. Adults rooted for him. And suddenly, Telly Savalas wasn't just the mysterious guy from The Twilight Zone, he was a superstar. Off-camera, he leaned into that image, flashy, confident, surrounded by music, family, and friends. He even launched a brief singing career and enjoyed surprising success in Europe. His later years were quieter, but he remained a fixture on screen until the early 90s. Telly Savalas passed away in 1994, but his presence never really left. He had that rare ability to dominate a scene without raising his voice. And in The Twilight Zone, it wasn't the doll you feared most, it was the man who underestimated her. And Frances, the doll who wanted to be real. When Frances stepped into The Twilight Zone, she wasn't just playing a role, she was playing a question. In the 1960 episode The After Hours, she portrayed Marcia White, a woman who enters a department store and discovers she might not be who, or what, she thinks she is. The episode unfolds like a waking dream, mannequins, mirrors, forgotten memories. And at the center of it all, Frances, wide-eyed, elegant, unraveling. She brought something rare to the screen, a mix of sophistication and vulnerability. There was always a sense that she knew more than she was letting on. It made her perfect for science fiction, mystery, and noir. And even before The Twilight Zone, Hollywood had already taken notice. Frances made headlines as one of the first women to lead a sci-fi film, Forbidden Planet, 1956. As Altera, she stood out not just for her looks, though she was famously beautiful, but for the intelligence and strength she gave her character. She wasn't window dressing. She had presence. And that carried into her television career, especially in the late 60s when she starred in Honey West, the first American TV series with a female private detective as the lead. It earned her an Emmy nomination and a permanent place in pop culture history. As the industry shifted, Frances didn't chase the spotlight. She worked steadily, raising a family, writing a memoir, and later speaking openly about her experience with aging in Hollywood. She remained sharp, graceful, and grounded. She passed away in 2011, leaving behind a legacy of roles that still feel modern, women who were complex, curious, and just a little out of reach. In The Twilight Zone, she played a mannequin who longed to be human. In real life, and Frances was always more than just the image. She was the soul behind the stare. Dennis Hopper, the rebel before the storm. Before he became Hollywood's ultimate outsider, Dennis Hopper stepped into the Twilight Zone as a young neo-Nazi in the 1963 episode He's Alive. It was a bold, disturbing role, one that hinted at how far Hopper was willing to go for truth on screen. He played the part with a wild-eyed intensity that made viewers uncomfortable, and that was the point. Rod Serling didn't cast Hopper to play it safe. He cast him because you couldn't look away. At the time, Hopper was still climbing. He did small roles in big films, Rebel Without a Cause, giant, often alongside legends like James Dean. But even then, Hopper didn't blend in. He was unpredictable, electric, and deeply committed to his craft, sometimes to the point of self-destruction. Then came Easy Rider, 1969, and everything changed. Hopper didn't just star in the counterculture classic, he co-wrote and directed it. The film blew the doors off Hollywood and redefined what independent cinema could look like. He was suddenly a symbol of freedom, chaos, and resistance. But success came at a price. The 1970s were turbulent for Hopper, both personally and professionally. He clashed with studios, disappeared into the excess of the era, and at times nearly lost everything. But like any true rebel, he came back. In the 80s and 90s, he rebuilt his career with unforgettable roles in Blue Velvet, Hoosiers, and Speed. He became a cult figure, respected for his raw honesty and unwillingness to play by the rules. He directed again, painted, photographed, and lived like a man with nothing left to prove. Dennis Hopper passed away in 2010, but his presence still lingers, restless, confrontational, fearless. Long before the motorcycles and madness, the Twilight Zone caught a glimpse of the storm that was coming. And even then, you could tell, Hopper wasn't acting. He was warning us. Martin Landau, the master of disguise who found himself. When Martin Landau appeared in the Twilight Zone episode The Jeopardy Room in 1964, he wasn't the hunted. He was the hunter, a cold, calculating assassin playing a lethal game of psychological chess. Landau delivered the role with icy precision, his presence coiled and dangerous. It was one of the more grounded, suspense-driven episodes. No aliens, no time travel, just a battle of wills. And Landau owned it. But the Twilight Zone was just one stop in a career built on transformation. Trained at the prestigious actor studio, Landau wasn't content to play himself. He wanted to disappear into roles, and for decades, he did just that. In the 1960s, he became a household name through Mission Impossible, where he played master of disguise role in hand. Week after week, Landau changed faces, voices, identities, always convincing, always just out of reach. Then, as Hollywood often does, it let him go. The 70s and early 80s were leaner years. He kept working, including on the sci-fi cult series Space, 1999, but the roles weren't the same. He became one of those faces people recognized, but couldn't quite place. Until 1994. That year, Martin Landau gave the performance of his life in Tim Burton's Ed Wood, playing aging horror icon Bela Lugosi. It was haunting, funny, heartbreaking, and real. Landau didn't just play Lugosi. He channeled every forgotten actor, every once great star, who slipped through the cracks. The Academy took notice. He won the Oscar, finally getting the recognition he'd long deserved. Landau continued acting well into his 80s, a true craftsman who never stopped chasing great material. When he passed in 2017, he left behind a body of work defined not by fame, but by range. In the Twilight Zone, he was the predator. But in life, Martin Landau was the quiet shapeshifter, always becoming someone new, and somehow always himself. Agnes Moorehead, the woman who said everything without saying a word. In one of the Twilight Zone's most haunting episodes, The Invaders, Agnes Moorehead plays a lone woman in a remote farmhouse, terrorized by tiny alien intruders. She says nothing for nearly the entire episode. Not a word. Just gasps, moans, screams, and the heavy breathing of someone being hunted. And yet, she delivers one of the most unforgettable performances in the series' history. That was Agnes Moorehead. She didn't need dialogue to dominate a scene, only presence. By the time she stepped into the Twilight Zone, Moorehead was already a seasoned actress with deep roots in radio, stage, and film. She had worked with Orson Welles, starred in Citizen Kane, and had 4 Academy Award nominations under her belt. But even with all that acclaim, she never fit neatly into the Hollywood mold. She wasn't there to be a starlet. She was there to work, and she worked with fire. Audiences today may know her best as Endora, the colorful, wisecracking mother on Bewitched. In that role, she blended theatrical flair with impeccable timing, stealing scenes with a single raised eyebrow. But she was always more than just the comic relief. There was depth in her eyes, the kind that told you she could turn serious in an instant. Off-screen, Moorhead was deeply private, fiercely independent, and intensely spiritual. She never chased celebrity. She chased great roles, and usually found them. She continued acting into her later years on stage and screen until her passing in 1974. Agnes Moorehead left behind a legacy not of volume, but of intensity. In the Twilight Zone, she fought off an alien invasion with only her body and her soul. And somehow, that told us more than any monologue ever could. She didn't need to speak. She just needed to be there, and we listened. George Takei, from forgotten episode to unshakable voice. When George Takei appeared in the Twilight Zone episode The Encounter in 1964, it should have been a breakout moment. Two men locked in a tense, psychological face-off inside a cluttered attic, grappling with guilt, war, and identity. But the episode was shelved for decades. Why? Because it tackled Japanese-American trauma and racism in a way that made people deeply uncomfortable. Too uncomfortable for the time. Takei's performance was raw, intimate, and rare for a young Asian-American actor in that era. It should have opened doors. Instead, the door quietly closed, at least for a while. But if the Twilight Zone hinted at the complexities beneath his calm exterior, Star Trek revealed them to the world. As Hikaru Sulu, helmsman of the Enterprise, George Takei became part of television history, not just as a character, but as a symbol of progress. In a time when Asian actors were sidelined or stereotyped, Sulu stood tall, professional, composed, and equal among equals. Yet Takei's greatest impact came not through science fiction but through his truth. In later years, he spoke openly about his childhood in Japanese-American internment camps during World War II, a story the country had long tried to forget. He used his platform to educate, advocate, and challenge injustice with clarity and warmth. He came out publicly in 2005, becoming one of the most visible LGBTQ+ voices in entertainment, long before it was common. Now in his 80s, George Takei has become something more than an actor. He's a speaker, a writer, a social media force, and a living bridge between generations. The episode that once hid him away is now seen as ahead of its time, just like the man himself. From the attic of the Twilight Zone to the stars of the Enterprise, George Takei never stopped moving forward. Donald Pleasance, the gentleman in a world that moved too fast. In the Twilight Zone episode The Changing of the Guard, Donald Pleasance plays Professor Ellis Fowler, an aging teacher forced into retirement, convinced his life's work has meant nothing. As snow falls outside his empty classroom, he contemplates the end, until spectral voices from his past arrive to remind him of his quiet impact. It's one of the most emotionally devastating episodes in the series, and Pleasance delivers it with heartbreaking restraint. No theatrics, just sorrow and a flicker of hope. That was Donald Pleasance's gift. He didn't shout. He lingered. Whether playing a kind soul or a disturbed villain, he brought a trembling humanity that few actors ever touch. Before Hollywood, Pleasance was a stage actor and a real-life World War II veteran, shot down, captured, and imprisoned in a German POW camp. When he returned to acting, there was something in him that couldn't be faked. A heaviness, a knowledge of what people are capable of, and how close despair can sit next to grace. He went on to play dozens of memorable roles: the blind forger in The Great Escape, the unforgettable villain Blofeld in the James Bond film You Only Live Twice, and of course, the relentless Dr. Loomis in Halloween. It was that last role, hunting the masked evil of Michael Myers, that turned Pleasance into a cult icon. But even then, he played it with depth. He didn't treat it like horror. He treated it like truth. Donald Pleasance worked nearly to the end of his life, his soft voice and haunted eyes still capturing attention well into the 1990s. He passed away in 1995, leaving behind a strange and beautiful legacy. In the Twilight Zone, he played a man who thought he'd been forgotten. In reality, Donald Pleasance was unforgettable because he never had to ask for your attention. He earned it. Ida Lupino, the woman who refused to wait for permission. In the Twilight Zone episode, The 16mm Shrine, Ida Lupino plays Barbara Jean Trenton, an aging movie star trapped in nostalgia, obsessively rewatching her old films and longing for a past that's slipping further away. It's a haunting portrayal of fame, vanity, and the loneliness of fading stardom. And for Lupino, it was more than just a role. It was a quiet commentary on the very industry she had spent her life refusing to let define her. Because Ida Lupino wasn't just an actress, she was a pioneer. In an era when women were expected to smile and stay in front of the camera, she made her way behind it. She was one of the first female directors in Hollywood, directing films with grit, nuance, and unflinching realism. She tackled subjects others wouldn't touch: unwed motherhood, sexual assault, mental illness, not for shock value, but because they mattered. Her directing credits ranged from hard-hitting B-movies to landmark television, including episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Have Gun, Will Travel, and even The Twilight Zone itself, making her the only person to both star in and direct episodes of the original series. She shattered ceilings without ever needing to raise her voice. Though her film career slowed in later decades, Lupino never vanished. She remained active in television, directing, and acting throughout the 60s and 70s, carving a space for herself in an industry that never quite knew what to do with a woman who wanted control. Ida Lupino passed away in 1995, but her legacy has only grown. Today, she's rightly remembered as one of Hollywood's first true female auteurs, a woman who didn't wait to be cast. She cast herself, and then called the shots. In The Twilight Zone, she played a star clinging to the past. In life, she raced ahead of her time. Cliff Robertson, the leading man who chose the long road. In the Twilight Zone episode 100 Yards Over the Rim, Cliff Robertson plays a weary pioneer crossing the desert in 1847, only to stumble into the modern world. Confused but determined, he discovers medical advances that could save his dying son back in the past. It's a story of time travel, yes, but more than that, it's about sacrifice, belief, and the hope that something better lies just over the horizon. That role fit Robertson perfectly: thoughtful, earnest, quietly strong. He wasn't a loud or flashy actor. He was a craftsman, someone who brought a sense of stillness to every part he played. And while he never chased celebrity, he earned something much rarer: respect. His breakthrough came in the 1960s with Charlie, a heartbreaking performance as a mentally challenged man who briefly gains genius-level intellect. It was risky, emotional, and deeply human. It won him the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1969, the kind of moment that usually launches a career into the stratosphere. But Cliff Robertson was different. He didn't follow the usual path. He chose roles based on meaning, not money. He worked steadily through the 70s and 80s in film and television, always on his own terms. He also stood up for integrity in an industry that often looks the other way. In 1977, Robertson exposed a major Hollywood studio embezzlement scandal, a brave move that briefly cost him work, but cemented his reputation as someone who wouldn't play the game just to stay relevant. In his later years, a new generation met him as Uncle Ben in Spider-Man 2002, delivering the line that would echo for decades: "With great power comes great responsibility." He lived that mantra, not just in fiction, but in life. Cliff Robertson passed away in 2011, but his work remains timeless, thoughtful, and full of quiet courage. In The Twilight Zone, he walked 100 yards into the future. In real life, he walked a steady path towards something even greater: integrity. John Lithgow, the man who looked terror in the face and made us believe it. John Lithgow never appeared in the original Twilight Zone series, but in Twilight Zone, the movie, he gave a performance so intense, so unhinged, that it became one of the most memorable moments in the franchise's entire legacy. In the reimagining of Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, he took on the role once made famous by William Shatner, a terrified airline passenger convinced there's a creature on the wing. But where Shatner was rattled, Lithgow was spiraling. Sweating, twitching, unraveling by the second, his portrayal turned a campy concept into something deeply psychological. This wasn't just fear of flying. This was a man fighting to hold on to reality at 30,000 feet. And once again, the Twilight Zone proved that it wasn't the monster outside that scared us most, it was the one inside. Of course, Lithgow's career stretches far beyond that one role. He's one of the few actors who can swing between terrifying and tender, hilarious and heartbreaking, without ever losing authenticity. He's played serial killers Dexter, Aliens, Third Rock from the Sun, kindly fathers, twisted villains, and Shakespearean kings. And through it all, he's remained a towering figure, literally and artistically. He's won Emmys, Tonys, Golden Globes, and respect across every medium. He writes children's books, performs one-man shows, and continues to choose projects that surprise even his fans. In an industry full of transformations, John Lithgow has made reinvention look effortless. In Twilight Zone, the movie, he looked out that plane window and saw his worst nightmare staring back. The rest of us, we just saw a masterclass in acting from a man who's never been afraid to take the leap. The Twilight Zone gave us more than eerie tales and clever twists. It gave us a stage where some of the greatest actors, and some you may have forgotten, delivered performances that still echo today. For many, it was a launching pad. For others, a rare spotlight. And for all of them, it was a chance to be part of something timeless. As we've seen, the paths they took after stepping out of the zone were anything but predictable. Some found lasting fame. Others quietly faded. A few came back stronger than ever. But each story, whether triumphant or tragic, adds another layer to the legacy of a show that never stopped asking the big questions about identity, time, fear, and hope. Looking back on these faces, we're not just remembering actors. We're remembering what they stood for, a time when TV dared to be strange, thoughtful, and human. And when even a single half-hour role could leave a mark that lasted a lifetime. Thank you for watching. If this video meant something to you, give it a like. It helps more people discover these stories and the legends behind them. And I'd love to hear from you. Who stood out the most? Whose story surprised you? Or maybe there's someone we didn't mention that you'd like to see included next time. I personally read and respond to every comment. And if you want more deep dives into the forgotten corners of Hollywood, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We've got more stories to tell and more legends to remember. This was the Twilight Zone, but the people behind it, they were real, and they're worth remembering. Always.